Great, thanks. We'll get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on some new tools for the I&E Measurement Library. Before we get started, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping, and then I'll go over the agenda as well. Next slide, Roxanne. So audio and video for participants are disabled. However, you can use the Q&A functionality in Zoom or the chat at any time if you have any questions or issues. The session is being recorded, and the recording and the presentation will be shared on the I&E website, as well as with all of the attendees with today's webinar via email. As well, closed captioning is available in English if you click on the closed captioning or CC option at the bottom of your screen. Next slide, Roxanne. So a brief overview of what we'll talk about today. I will go over the measurement library briefly, and then we'll jump into our 3 tools that we will be learning more about today, and then have a portion for question and answer at the end. Next slide, Roxanne. So my name is Sarah Montgomery, and I am the Knowledge Management Coordinator for I&E, and I am also our focal point for the I&E Measurement Library. And to give you a brief overview of the Measurement Library, it was launched about 1.5 years ago through a partnership with IRC and NYU Global Ties for Children. It's a collection of measurement tools to assess children's learning and holistic development and service provider quality in crisis contexts. There's currently 17 tools and 1 measure inventory in the library, although that is rapidly expanding. The library, when it launched, originally focused on psychosocial support and social emotional learning at the program and individual level in the Middle East, North Africa, Turkey, or MENAT region. However, with the support of IRC and NYU, along with the I&E Measurement Library Reference Group, the library continues to expand beyond PSS, SEL, and beyond the MENAT region to help key stakeholders generate the high quality data they need to reflect on their work, identify critical gaps and solutions in programming, and to the overall improvement and measurement and assessment in the EIE space. Through the support of the Measurement Library Reference Group, opportunities for I&E members to submit new measures and tools for consideration will be available in the coming months. And we're gonna announce that and publicize that through various I&E communications channels. So stay tuned, and there will be many opportunities to submit your own measures and tools for the Measurement Library. So with that very brief overview, I will pass it on to Haiyun, who will discuss the RSQ.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction. So like Sarah just said, I'm going to introduce the Response to Stress Questionnaire, RSQ, focused on academic problems. So this is a measure of school-related stress and stress reactivity, and has been tested with the children, Syrian refugee children in Lebanon. Next. So there has been really a global push towards integrating the refugee children in the host community's national education systems to achieve the equitable and sustainable inclusion of the refugee children. While this is actually have been known as a sustainable and meaningful solution to provide access to education for the refugee population, it also puts refugee children in a situation that could be potentially very stressful. Next. Yeah, more. Yeah, so these children, because they are in a different country and different educational system, they may be put in a position where they are not familiar to the national curriculum that they are learning. They may be also not familiar to the language, instructional language that they are learning with. For example, in Lebanon, while they all speak Arabic, at some point, the Lebanese national curriculum are taught in second language, either English or French, that the Syrian refugee children may not be familiar to. And they also have to navigate a potentially challenging relationship with the host communities, teachers, and their classmates, that there might be a lot of tension between them because they are asked to share their resources, and they are often strained with the influx of refugee population in their own public schools. And also they are going through their very challenging lives as a refugee. Potentially they are maybe engaged in child labor. They are supposed to help with their families at home, and they may not have enough time to engage in academic work that they are expected to as in the host community schools that they are going to. Next. So it is really important to monitor their stress levels and how they are responding to their stress for the refugee population as they are integrated into the national education systems. But there has not been a many measure of understanding, capturing the stress level and their stress responses, particularly for refugee children, but also in child population in general. So when we are looking at the stress and stress responses that children usually experience, there are largely two types of responses when the children are exposed to stress that gets elicited. So the first is involuntary response, which is typically an automatic and often temperamental or innate response to the stress. So it could be emotional or physical, like they start crying or shaking, or their heart rate goes up and so on. And excessive level of involuntary response has been related to internalizing and externalizing symptoms. There also is a voluntary coping strategies, which is a conscious effort to cope with the stress and regulate themselves to using cognitive and behavioral strategies such as cognitive reappraisal, deep breathing, or seeking solutions. So I'm gonna take a big, deep breath here to regulate my own stress at this point. Children can engage in either or both of these responses, and they usually, as they grow up, naturally develop the more voluntary coping strategies to deal with the stress. But when in a situation where the refugees children are often at, when they experience a lot of trauma and they are experiencing a lot of chronic stress at home and other contexts, this stress level the stressors that they are exposed to at schools may increase their involuntary responses and resulted in other problems. Next slide, please. Oh, somehow the images didn't make good again, but yeah, that's fine. So the RSQ that we are using are tested for program evaluation and basic research purposes. So it has been adapted and tested to evaluate mindfulness programming with the Syrian refugee children attending Lebanese public schools. So it is specifically looking at the school-related stress and stress reactivity, which is more involuntary engagement that we need to keep an eye on. Next slide. So, so we adapted the existing response to stress questionnaire that has been developed and validated in the US. As you can see, there's a host of different surveys that's being used in the US context in the link you can see at the bottom. So it is consisting of largely two parts. The first part is asking about the stress experience on a specific target domain. For example, the school-related academic stressors or family depression, or for example, a lot of chronic health problems, cancer patients, and so on. So those are specific to stressors. They also have the section on response to stress, which asks about voluntary coping strategies and involuntary responses. So it's originally consisting of 57 item scale, and it's really challenging to ask all these questions in a research context of working with the refugees. And a lot of the voluntary coping strategies are not really developmentally appropriate for the population that we work for. So we selected the two subscales. One is the school-related stress experience. We picked academic problems that they already have, which is a 10-item scale. We picked the subscale of the involuntary response, which we specifically were interested in involuntary engagement of subscale, including physical arousal, intrusive thought, rumination, and emotional arousal, and involuntary actions. These are more potentially detrimental for when it is excessively expressed. So we have this 25-item questionnaire. Next slide, please. Next. So the resulting survey that we adapted is a self-report questionnaire as to children. We conducted through a verbal interview, but depending on the population, it could be done with a paper and pencil. So it's consisting of two subscales, like I said, 10 items on school-related stress. So this scale asks children about their stressful experiences in the past 6 months on an items like doing badly on a test or paper, not understanding classes, teachers yell at them or gets angry at them, and how much stress they feel in these situations. And the second scale is the 15-item stress reactivity scale. So it asks children about their responses when they are exposed to this type of stress in school. So it includes the questions like, when dealing with the school problems, I feel sick to my stomach and get a headache. I keep remembering school problems that happened or can't stop thinking about what might happen. I get really jumpy when I'm dealing with the stress of the school problems. And to these questions, children are asked to respond in 4-point scale, not at all, a little, somewhat, and a lot. Next, please. So we tested this measure in Lebanon with this Syrian refugee population in Bekaa Valley and Akkar, with about 2,300 Syrian refugee children aged 5 to 15. So all of these children, by the requirement of the programming, were enrolled in Lebanese formal schools. So we asked these questions about their school experience. And they all had access to some form of IRC education programming. And it is developed, so it is developed and used for program evaluation that we were evaluating with IRC on the social emotional learning, in particular the mindfulness programming and the remedial education program as well. Next slide, please. So we got a rating for ready for use for purpose with adaptation for context by the INE library, which I'm very happy with. So it does show a strong evidence of reliability with very high over 0.9 Cronbach's alpha and McDonald's omega level with strong internal consistency. And it also shows a strong evidence of construct validity, including very stable vector structure of those two subscales and with the high vector loadings. And it's also measurement invariant, meaning they are on the same scale and comparable across different time points before and after the intervention, and also different treatment groups, which is important when you're comparing different treatments impacts. And also across the age groups, we have a wide age range, 5 to 15. So that was also an important point. And also gender. The perception of stress may be different by the gender, but that the measure is comparable to be used for both gender. So but we are not quite ready in terms of the full validation. So the additional evidence is necessary to further strengthen the evidence of the validity, including the convergent validity with other theoretically related constructs like physiological measures of stress. We also are in need of more predictive validity, including how it's related to later mental health and academic skills, which we are planning to do so in the coming next studies. Next slide, please. So for when you are, if you're interested in this measure, please consider a few things. So the first of all, this is one measure of stress response in a very particular types of stress. So it is important to consider different sources of the report. So child report, parent report, and teacher report, triangulating them may be helpful to understand how they are related, and also understanding how it's related to physiological arousal that could be measured through heart rate or hair sample. But all these different measures captures a different types of stress response as well as different time span. For example, heart rate is very temporary. The hair sample is really long term. And this is measuring somewhat in the middle. So please consider those variations in terms of measuring the stress, but a further validation with triangulating with other measures can be helpful. And I would also recommend revising the prompt to shorten the time period that we are asking for. So we asked children to reflect on the past 6 months' experience, which we did because of the timing of the assessment. But we are finding the stress responses and the stress level is very temporary, likely vary a lot depending on the time. And it is a lot to ask child to reflect on the full 6 months of experience. So I would recommend more of a 2-week period. And lastly, and we recommend more rigorous piloting and revision of the items of both stress experience and stress reactivity when you're applying this to a different population and different culture. There may be a very different way of expressing their stress responses or their physical reactions or emotional reactions, depending on the culture and language. So those need to be carefully adapted. And this is really developed for research and evaluation purposes. So please do not use it for other purposes without further validation for that particular purpose. And lastly, please check back for more evidence and updates. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thanks, Hayan. We will now move to Clay, who will discuss the holistic assessment for learning.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Haiyang. And hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. So my name is Clay Westrop, and I'm an advisor for research, evidence, and learning in the Department of Education and Child Protection at Save the Children. So I'm really pleased to speak with you today about the Holistic Assessment for Learning measure that we developed in partnership with UNICEF and NYU Global Ties with funding from Education Cannot Wait. So today I'll briefly provide an overview of the domains and subtasks contained within the measure, its purpose and toolkit contents, details about where the measure was piloted, and then recommendations for its use. Next slide. So we developed the HAL, or Holistic Assessment for Learning, as a performance-based assessment, formative assessment for use in grades 2 and 3 in formal school settings in Syria. The measure contains subtasks across the 3 domains of literacy, numeracy, and social and emotional skills. Pilot results indicate that the measure takes approximately 35 to 45 minutes to administer in its entirety. However, we found that teachers typically preferred to administer by domain over 3 separate sessions with a single child. The measure includes different grade versions for several subtasks that you can see outlined in red on the slide. And this is aligned to the relevant curriculum and accounts for the ceiling effects we found during the pilot in some instances where only single grade versions were initially developed. Additionally, in the literacy domain, the items in the letter sounds and familiar words subtasks are ordered based on the match between the letter sound or word as pronounced in Modern Standard Arabic and the Syrian dialect. So letter sounds and words that were more closely matched across both Modern Standard Arabic and the dialect versions were easier for children to identify than those that had less proximal pronunciations. This is one key feature of the measure that makes it linguistically appropriate for the Arabic-speaking Syrian context. Next slide. So we place great emphasis on ensuring that the measure made conceptual sense based on Arabic child developmental theory and research, that it aligned with Syrian curriculum goals, was contextually relevant, and was linguistically appropriate. So with this in mind, we developed the measure through a consultative and collaborative test development and piloting process. This consultative process proceeded in 5 phases. It included conducting secondary analyses of existing and relevant literacy, numeracy, and social emotional assessment data in the Syrian response region. The second step was triangulating secondary psychometric results with theory and practice at a workshop that we held in Amman, Jordan, with 17 regional experts, curriculum specialists, and developmental psychologists with expertise in applied psychometrics. The third step was integrating, assembling, and piloting the HAL measure, and then piloting psychometric analyses. And then the final step was triangulating the psychometric results with theory and practice at a second consultative workshop with those same 17 regional experts. And then finally, we piloted the measure with teachers, given that this is a formative assessment and teachers are the ones who would be administering this. We wanted to understand how feasible it was for teachers to administer the measure. So we trained teachers, we organized teacher learning circles for peer support, and monitored their use to understand challenges they had with administration. So throughout this distinctive and rigorous process, our driving goal was to ensure that the measure was feasible for teachers to administer, that it was contextually relevant, and that it was immediately actionable as a formative assessment in the classroom. Next slide. So the final toolkit contains 3 components. There's an assessment tool pack containing all the stimuli needed for administration. There are teacher notation sheets for teachers to use in scoring the assessment for each child. And then finally, there's a teacher guide providing administration guidance as well as activities that can be used in the classroom to help develop skills that may need support based on the results of the assessment. Next slide. So as I noted previously, since we were developing an assessment for formative purposes, we wanted to ensure that the results were immediately actionable in the classroom. So for each measured skill, there are related activities linked to the results of each subtask. So these activities are easy for teachers to use in the classroom and fun for children. Next slide. So we piloted the measure in the Northeast, Northwest, and Euphrates Shield regions of Syria among 1,456 grade 2 and grade 3 children at the end of 2018 and the beginning of 2019. And 48% of the sample consisted of girls. And data were collected in partnership with Integrity Global. So we encountered 2 key limitations at this pilot stage. The first is that we found that trained enumerators inconsistently applied the stop and skip rules throughout administration. So this likely led to additional error in the data. We've since worked to ensure that these rules are clearer in the administration guidance and are emphasized in any training as well. And then the second limitation was present in the factor analysis of the pilot data. So in the subtask level factor analyses of the literacy and numeracy data, assumed that all items within a subtask discriminate to the same degree between underlying ability levels or load equally onto a latent subtask construct. However, the IRT analyses showed that this assumption didn't hold for all subtasks. So while this may have been a larger concern for high stakes test situations, given the formative purpose of the assessment, we decided to retain all items to ensure a breadth of information available to teachers for feedback purposes. And then as I indicated previously, we additionally piloted the measure for feasibility with 26 teachers in Aleppo and Idlib. All right, next slide. So if you're interested in using the HAL, we have a few recommendations for its use. First, context. The measure was developed and tested specifically for the Syrian context for use in formal schools. It's constructed with the Syrian curriculum, teaching practices, and linguistic characteristics in mind. Considerations for use in other Arabic-speaking contexts outside of Syria would require substantial contextualization and revision and would not be recommended. Additionally, the measure was specifically developed for use in formal schools. We're currently looking to test how it performs in non-formal settings in Syria and expect needing to return to some of the key decision points to make necessary revisions. At this point, we don't recommend using this assessment in non-formal settings until we have further tested it. Second, purpose. So the measure is intended to be administered by teachers with learners in their classroom 2 to 3 times per year for formative feedback and to identify activities that can be integrated into instruction to build skills where gaps are identified. We do not recommend using this measure for summative purposes, such as to evaluate a program, for example. And third, training. Given that the measure is intended to be used by teachers, high quality training is critical. So when training teachers to use the measure in the classroom, we found that teacher learning circles were an effective means of peer support following the training to ensure accurate and meaningful support during administration. Next slide. All right. Well, thank you for your time. And I really want to thank both UNICEF and NYU Global Ties, as well as the 17 regional experts and Integrity Global for their partnership in developing and piloting this measure. So we look forward to seeing the measure used to help inform teachers in the classroom and contribute to improving learning outcomes across Syria. Thank you.
Thanks, Clay. And we'll now go to the TCO with Jungmin and Autumn.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Autumn Brown. I'm a former education technical advisor at the IRC and current PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm presenting today with Jungmin Lee, who's our senior researcher at the IRC, and the IRC Tanzania program senior program manager, Dennis Nombo, and the deputy coordinator, Elfrida Jaffet. And we're really excited to be presenting on the teacher classroom observation instrument and its use in Tanzania and its psychometric properties. We're going to be going over the process of developing the tool, how it was used exactly in Tanzania, including the training process, and then Jungmin's going to take us through the psychometrics and then the recommendations moving forward. So why did we create the TCO in the first place? There's a lot of observation tools out there, but none of them were validated specifically in the kind of context where the IRC works. And also during the IRC's 2020 initiative was to become evidence-based and evidence generating. And part of that was measuring important pathways in our theories of change, and such a huge leverage point in IRC's education programming is improving teacher practice, implementing programming via teachers. So measuring not only the quality of those practices, but the fidelity of implementing different curriculum was really important. So the IRC started the process of creating our own tool. Next slide. It was really important to have something not only that worked in the context, but that was also really adaptable for a variety of purposes, because observations used at the IRC for coaching, for monitoring and reporting, and also for research. Next slide. The process of developing the TCO, I went through a lot of different iterations, but I kind of just want to highlight here that the first step was really looking at different teacher classroom observation tools that had been in use across different IRC programs around the world, and looking at which items were in common across those to kind of create like a tool that had a core set of items that we could then understand how it was working, hopefully validate, and then share more widely. So that was the first version, really was the basis of this desk review of all these different observation tools, and then a lot of testing with teams, with teachers, with coaches, and further iterations based on that. Can move forward, there's some, there we go. So the instrument that we ended up using in Tanzania was a later version that we tried to keep short with these 22 items that comprise these 4 different dimensions: time on task, teaching practice, classroom management, and the emotional supportiveness in the classroom. So this is what the Tanzania version ended up looking like. I'm going to pass it on to my colleagues in Tanzania, Dennis and Elfrida.
Basically, the TCO in Tanzania have been used for different projects, which is PVAC, Preventing Violence Against Children, and the ongoing project on FCDO. As it has been presented, it has been used to evaluate for evaluation and coaching and mentoring of the teachers. Through the PVAC, we reached out 500 teachers, and the results were positive. The teachers' attitude have been improved, and they are observing the protection in the classrooms. But under FCDO project, we are utilizing the project through across all 3 camps, unlike PVAC, which focused much on one of the refugee camp in Tanzania. But through FCDO project, we have been able to do it across all 3 camps, and that has been providing positive impact, and it has been integrated as the daily tool to be used for monitoring and evaluation, but supporting and coaching the teachers on the to improve their area of expertise when they are in the classroom, including teaching practices and protection within the classroom. Thank you.
Autumn, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. The training went through as many iterations as the instrument did. And a goal of ours, and really a huge challenge, was keeping it really short. The training was actually done in 2.5 days. That 5 days is incorrect. So the training was 2.5 days in Tanzania, training enumerators. And I think that's important, just because in emergency contexts, especially, being able to roll out and train enumerators in a really short amount of time is really crucial. So I think some things that my hypothesis anyway of what gave us, what made this instrument work with such a short training was we did shoot videos in classrooms, like with iPads the day before the training, and then use those videos for an entire day after training on observation and what the different items were. It was really watching videos, scoring using the tool, and then testing inter-rater reliability during the training, and really focusing on those items where the inter-rater reliability wasn't as great. Another thing was we trained a larger group of enumerators and then chose a smaller group to become the actual raters to collect this baseline teacher classroom observation data. And they went and observed the classrooms really shortly after this training, which I think was another crucial component. Next slide. So this training package is going to be going along with the instrument, and I think that's they're important together. And it includes a facilitator's guide with really clear step-by-step instructions on how to complete the training, the PowerPoint, all the handout, and different activities. And also guidance on how to use the videos during trainings to make sure that the inter-rater reliability is high before the raters go and collect the data. So after the training, we had 2 raters go to each classroom and observe 143 teachers so that we could then look at the agreement between those raters. And so Jungmin Lee is going to take us a little bit through the different psychometric analysis that we did.
Okay, thank you, Autumn. Next slide, please. So with this data set, we evaluated the psychometric qualities of TCO in 4 areas, and they include item difficulty, to see how well TCO items capture different variations in teacher competencies, And the inter-rater agreement was examined to see how much agreement or consensus was achieved among different raters when TCO was used by different raters. And then we used Gryffindor's alpha and ICC estimators for these, and we interpret the alpha values greater than 0.67 and ICC scores greater than 0.75 show a good evidence of inter-rater agreement. And construct validity was examined. Oh, yes, thank you. Construct validity was examined to see whether TCO measures what it claims to measure. And for this, we conducted a series of factor analysis, and results were interpreted based on several goodness of fit indices. And finally, composite or construct reliability was examined to see whether there is internal consistency in TCO items. When coefficient omega scores were greater than 0.6, we concluded that there is an internal consistency reliability. Next slide, please. So for item difficulty, the graphs here show that overall the TCO scores are well spread out across the 4-point scale from low to high, indicating TCO captures variations in teacher competencies. But click on, yes, except these two items where scores are positively skewed. And the next slide, please. In terms of inter-rater agreement, we observed that TCO items had a good to excellent level of inter-rater agreement, as all Gryffindor's alpha and ICC scores were higher than their thresholds. Next slide, please. And in terms of construct validity, we observed that the initial 3-factor model that was built on TCO's original design didn't have a good fit to the data. So we revised this model by removing items that had weak factor loadings or negative inter-item correlations within across constructs. And with this revision, the reduced form of the 3-factor model showed a good fit to the data. Next slide, please. So the graph here visually shows the final model we confirmed. And as you can see here, all items were loaded very well on their intended factor. And the 3 factors of teachers' use of teaching methods and provision of emotional support and classroom management also had reasonable and positive correlations with one another. And lastly, the items within each factor show good and strong evidence of internal consistency reliability measured by coefficient omega. Next slide, please. So with these findings, we conclude that TCO can be used reliably and validly within the context of teacher coaching, monitoring, impact studies in Tanzania, and we welcome others to replicate or extend our studies in other settings beyond Tanzania in the future. And then I think the Tanzania team can make some practical, some suggestions how to use TCO in practice. Elfrieda or Dennis?
Okay. What I can say that during the implementation, it's good to make sure all the parties are being involved, including the teachers and the other people who will be the enumerators and be coaching the teachers. And since it's on the great impact as it's covering both the technical and protection aspects in the classrooms, we do recommend the use of this tool in other education institutions and adapt it in accordingly. For instance, in Tanzania, we are also using the tool in the EdTech project classrooms within the refugee camps, and it has been easier and helpful to evaluate the teachers who are teaching in the EdTech project. So basically, make sure all the stakeholders are involved and they understand the tool so that it's not bringing the negative impact to the teachers. It doesn't mean to be only evaluation for the teachers, but making sure it's supporting and improving their teaching practices and expertise in the classroom.
Next slide, please. So we believe that soon we're going to share what we find, synthesize the findings into report, and we share it with other people through the INEA measurement library. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at this email. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All, and we'll turn it over to Roxanne, who will facilitate the Q&A. If all the panelists want to turn their videos on.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for those presentations. If you're new to the measurement library, just so you know, what we do is we share on the measurement landing page an overview of the findings of how the measure was tested. And then there is the ability to download a set of materials, which typically includes a technical working paper that has details about the evidence of how well the tool was working, and as well as the measurement tool itself, as long as the evidence was strong enough. If it's still under development, then we ask you to contact the developer to access the measurement tool, as well as training materials. The training materials were developed for the original testing, so it's something to take into consideration. We definitely recommend reviewing all of the materials and thinking deeply about what types of adaptations need to be made for your own context, the measurement tool, as well as the training materials. And as much guidance as possible is included in those technical working papers. So definitely take a look. The response to stress questionnaire and the holistic assessment for learning were both updated in the measurement library, I believe, this morning, so they should be accessible there. Okay, so we're gonna spend a little bit of time answering some of the questions that were brought up during the presentations, but if you have additional questions that were not brought up then that you'd like to ask, if we have a little bit of time at the end, you can add those to the Q&A or raise your hand. Okay, so I'm gonna go through the ones that my colleagues have highlighted. And try to target these to the different presenters. Okay, so for the response to stress questionnaire for Haiyan, the first question is, have you tried comparing these questionnaires with similar tools and stress measures in non-humanitarian settings to unpack the likely association with refugee status?
Yeah, so I think that is a very complex question at multiple dimensions. Quick answer is we did not have any other measure that measures stress per se. We do have a related constructs like mental health, like internalizing symptoms and so on. But this was the only measure that was used, and because it was in the context of much bigger RCT, we couldn't collect much more data than this. So the quick answer is no. That we do have. We only have the data from the refugee population, so we couldn't compare the refugee children with non-refugee children for Lebanon project. We do have the data from Niger that has a refugee and non-refugee population. So that might be something that we could add to the measurement library as evidence comes up about the refugee children status and the stress level.
Thank you, Haiyan. Okay, now a question for Clay. Is the HAL based on IDELA? How is it different?
Great question. HAL is not based on IDELA. So IDELA is designed as a summative assessment instrument for children 3.5 to 6 years old. HAL was developed as a formative assessment measure, specifically for use by teachers in formal schools in Syria in grades 2 and 3. So the age ranges are different. The purpose is different, summative versus formative. And many of the skills measured are different. So great question.
Thanks, Clay. So I'm going to keep going through and then we'll circle back to folks if we have time. For the IRC team, and Autumn, who's in my head still part of the IRC team, how did you control for teachers' bias stemming from administering the tool?
Teacher bias or rater bias, or what?
The question is teacher bias, but I think that maybe starting by clarifying who was administering the tool, and I think that the bias probably relates to that in the question.
The tool was administered by trained external enumerators. And for eliminating bias, I think it was as part of the training focusing on bias. And there's a section of the training on cognitive bias, and then the continued practice using the tool as objectively as possible. I don't think you can ever completely eliminate bias in observation, but hopefully the training does a good enough job that we can have valid and reliable results.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the RSQ, and I think that Haiyan actually did a pretty good job of addressing some of the questions around the contextualization. So I'm going to ask one of the other questions, which is around the age group, which was fairly broad. And the question is, to what extent have you allowed for variation in questions and tools within the age group?
Yeah, that's a really great question. This is a typical issue with any self-report measures, and we did have a large age difference within our sample. So it was something that we considered. The main challenge for this particular survey was that young children didn't really have a clear concept of stress. So we actually worked with the local staff and enumerator to develop the definition of stress for young children in the terms that they can understand. So we gave some examples. I don't have it on top of my head what the exact definition was, but it was addressed in a way, because it was a verbal interaction, it was addressed by explaining, the enumerator explaining the children depending on their comprehension level. And that goes with all the other items that could have been more difficult for children.
Thank you, Haiyan. So a second question for Clay is, how did Save the Children ensure a standardized administration approach across teachers? And did they notice clustered variation or bias according to the teacher?
Yeah, so there were two pilot phases here. We first piloted the measure with children using trained enumerators. So at that point, teachers were not involved in the data collection. And the purpose of that pilot phase was to collect data that could be used in the validation of the measure, running the psychometric analyses. So at that point, teacher bias would not have been a factor. The second pilot phase was actually training teachers to use the measure, providing peer support and monitoring, and trying to understand whether the measure was feasible for teachers to use in their classroom. We did not actually collect the data that the teachers collected at that point. The purpose of that really was to work with teachers and ensure that they were comfortable using it and that it was feasible for them to use. So we don't have any data around teacher bias in the data. A great question.
Thanks, Clay. And then another question on the TCO is what do you think would be the challenges or affordances of the TCO being used by district level education staff for sustainability? And there's, I think, a similar question, not exactly similar, but kind of in the same vein around using the TCO outside of refugee contexts.
Frida, are you there? Can you comment to this question?
Yes, I can do. Based on the content which is within the tool, it can be applicable in the district level, but depending on the restriction and procedures within the government on adapting the tools, because most of the government officials have their own tools which have been developed. So it might be the challenge while implementing it. But if they are being involved from the scratch, it will take time, but it can be integrated in the one of the tools to be used in the government schools. And since most of the aspects which were observed, they were developed from the tools which are used in the refugee context. So we might have skipped some of the aspects which are found in the government schools, and it will need to be considered and adapted accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I have another question for Clay here, actually. So the question is, if the remedial activities are only for the literacy and numeracy dimensions, not the SEL, would you expect this to affect the sustainability of the instrument for non-cognitive dimensions?
Yeah, great question. And apologies if this wasn't clear in my presentation, but there are activities related to all skills measured in the measure. So that there are activities linked to each of the subtasks across literacy, numeracy, and SEL.
And a follow-up question on that is again asking kind of the comparison between ISELA and Hall, and asking if they were both trialed in the same context, was there harmony in SEL results between the tools, or have you done any comparison of the results from the two tools?
We have not done a comparison, but that's a great idea to do. But yeah, we have not done a comparison.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think that we're just about at the end of the hour. So if there are additional questions, we'll try to share any responses to those back with the link to the recording and all of that. Sarah, do you have any closing words you want to say before we wrap things up?
I just want to thank everyone for joining, and we will be sharing the presentations and recording via email. The panelists' emails are also included in the presentation if you have follow-up questions directly for the panelists. And yeah, I think with that, we'll close. And thanks everyone for joining, and hope everyone has a good rest of their morning, day, evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.